Okay, so today's Planning Live is a homegrown special. I'm delighted to be joined by our three planning partners, Neil Collar, Elaine Farquharson-Black and Karen Hamilton, who will shortly be discussing the highs and lows of the planning year so far and what we can expect to look forward to in the next 6 months. Okay, to get us started then. It wouldn't be 2023 so far if I didn't ask about NPF4, which of course is now award-winning, having won Planning Magazine's award for planning to address climate change. It was published on the 13th of February, so it's had its first 100 days. What's the verdict so far? Over to you, Elaine.
Well, I suppose my bag being housing. I spoke at Heads of Planning event back in January, and I warned that in the short term, there was going to be uncertainty and delay as all stakeholders, and the private and the public sector and the consultees got to grip with all the additional requirements for planning applications under NPF4. I may be biased, but I would say that housing is arguably the sector that's been most affected, by NPF4, because we've, seen the removal of the need to maintain a 5-year effective housing land supply at all times. The tilted balance, which came from SPP, and where housing could be considered to be development which contributed to sustainable developments, has gone. We've now got the MATLers, the minimum, all tenure housing land requirement. They haven't yet been translated into local housing requirements or the housing pipelines that NPF4 says. And of course, NPF4 has that quite narrowly drawn exceptional housing release policy in policy 16F, which is triggered by over-delivery rather than under-delivery. Now, obviously, most of the time we're talking about under-delivery rather than would be a very unusual planning authority that's over-delivered.
It would be a nice problem to have.
It would be a lovely problem to have. And obviously, we then had the Chief Planner issuing her transitional guidance letter, on the 8th of February, which said that policy 16F should take priority over an LDP's exceptional release policy in the event of conflict. That's been countered by various KC's opinion, which is saying that, in fact, there is no conflict and that the policy 16F can't actually be enforced, if you like, at the moment. And that then led to the recall of the Miller and the Moss End planning appeal, and then the sifting of a dozen other housing appeals pending the ministers issuing their view on the operation of policy 16F. SEPA's also acted quite quickly in terms of the climate change and the looking at the flood, what we were all dealing with 1 in 200 floods. Now we've got to do climate change, and that's affecting a whole load of housing sites, allocated sites that were going through the system, now suddenly got to look at it. So I think I've been right in terms of the uncertainty and delay, certainly, for housing, and at a time, of great concern, the housing crisis. At the moment, we've got this gap. What's going to happen? What's going to? We've potentially got court challenges, facing us. So the jury's still out, maybe, from the housing point of view. What about you, Karen?
Well, housing. I mean, you're absolutely right that's the sector that I think has been most affected from I suppose, a negative standpoint. Neil's no doubt got something to say about the renewables industry, which I think will tell a different story, but it's perhaps stating the obvious just to say that NPF4, of course, affects all development sectors, just given the nature of the policies, and whether it's demolition of an old office block to redevelop as something that's maybe more fit for purpose, and that could find itself or those promoting the development could be grappling with the statement on demolition, or it could be a BTR development that's having to consider whether affordable housing is something that now might have to be provided, as we know in particular problems in Glasgow and some other authority areas where perhaps they haven't had a specific affordable housing policy before. But just to give another example, I thought I'd recommend that people perhaps take a look at an appeal decision that was just published last Friday, hot off the press on the DP website, relating to an out-of-centre retail proposal in Dunfermline. So this is one of the cases where it's an unallocated site, but nonetheless within an area that was designated as an urban area, or known as an urban area, sort of surrounded by housing. So again, an application that was having to grapple with, you know, the transitional phase, having been submitted, you know, back in 2021, refused in 2022, but, you know, before the last version of NPF 4 came out, and now having been refused on appeal. But what I thought was very interesting from the case was seeing the approach taken by the reporter to grappling with some of the NPF 4 policies, and really sort of looking at the detail of them. So particularly interesting discussion around climate change and sustainability, and of course local living and the 20-minute neighbourhoods. So the applicants might have thought that they were doing quite well, where the council's transport team had recognised it as being an accessible site. But I think ultimately the nature of the particular proposal, because it had an emphasis on bulky goods, limited food provision, the reporter had to think, well, actually, is that really ticking the local living box? Mm-hmm. So ultimately, in terms of the NPF 4 policies, the proposal fell down across a range of fronts, but they looked at policies 1 and 2 on climate change, obviously. Quite interesting to see that the reporter seemed to regard policy 1 as being a specific proposal to be looked at, rather than just, you know, some kind of overarching policy that perhaps didn't mean quite as much. And ultimately, you know, the site wasn't looked at as being sustainable. So really digging into those themes around sustainability. So that's a retail example, and obviously every case is going to, you know, stand on its own particular facts. But
so what was that an example of that? Because we talked about this before, the balancing of the policies. Because obviously there's, you know, a lot of policies, and it's the weight to be attached is for the decision maker, and that's interesting in terms of putting the weight, as you say, on climate change, on policy 1, where I think we did, when we were chatting last time, thought it was more of an overarching, you know, obviously all applications have to have regard to it, but obviously weight being put on it.
Well, that's right. And it was, I think the reporter described it as being a proposal which didn't meet the strict terms of policy 1 and 2. So I thought that was interesting. Having said that, he obviously had sympathy for the fact that the proposal did contain a number of sustainable measures, and it was a well-located site for walking and cycling. There was some discussion with the reporter had around, you know, when we're thinking about transport and with where technology is at the moment, inevitably anything involving a private car is never going to be emissions free. And so there was a recognition of all of that. But I think it just begins to illustrate, you know, the difficulties that developers may be facing across a number of fronts. But it probably is one of the first cases that's really shown how policies are being applied in detail away from the housing arena, and perhaps away from, you know, the renewables front. But on that note, Neil, give us some better news on renewables.
Well, before I do that, I'm just picking up on some of the themes you were touching on there. I think the verdict on NPF 4 is a bit wait and see still, because it's still quite transitional, because we're still dealing with either appeals against applications that were refused under the old system, or applications that were conceived under the old system, or indeed, I suppose, development proposals that were conceived under the old system. So it's got that inherent awkwardness. And initially, it was very frustrating, the appeals we were doing, to see council responses to NPF 4, which didn't reassess the case. It just cherry-picked the bit that suited the case they'd previously run under the old policy.
Heaven forbid.
Indeed. None of us ever quote shop.
No.
But I think there's still an element of that thinking that will take a while to wash out of the system at the local authority level. Yes, I think it's easier for reporters as a fresh pair of eyes, as you were saying, to come and do the full-scale sort of reanalysis. I think planning officers are still a bit too familiar with their LDP, and that is their starting point, irrespective of the fact that NPF has maybe change the emphasis slightly, if not fundamentally, depending. So I think it's going to take a while for all of that to wash through. But that overall interpretation point is a really interesting one, that I think that's where we've seen the difficulty that the way NPF4 is put together, it is easy for people to dip in and pull something out and say, aha, rather than read it as a whole. And of course, part of the problem is it's a big document to read as a whole, and to actually look and say, well, yes, maybe in terms of this policy, you don't tick the box, but actually there's another policy there, which really, when you read as a whole, is more overarching and more important. And I suppose that's really what gets me onto the renewables policy, that's the disappointment for the renewables industry, that while on the one hand, NPF4 is incredibly positive and supportive, because the only restriction is not in national parks and national scenic areas. Everything else, okay, it's a support in principle. But the disappointment is planning officers who jump on, oh, it's only support in principle, and then go off and look at another policy and say, well, you don't comply with that, in their opinion. And then it becomes a massive thumbs down, despite the fact, as you said, policy one, that overarching climate emergency, and you can't get something that is more aligned with addressing the climate emergency than a onshore wind project. So I think we can see the continuing problem there, but in a sense, I suppose we're all looking for NPF4 to do something which it can never do, because it can never be prescriptive enough to satisfy us. The planning system is inherently flexible, discretionary, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the way it's always been. It's the way it's always going to continue to be. But it is just, I think, it's a bit too early yet to see the influence NPF4 will have, because it's not been in place long enough for particularly the local authority level people to really get used to the new approach, to get used to applying it through, and for that change to come through.
That's probably fair comment.
Well, it's funny because you said there, you know, you read it as a whole. I read it as a whole, and then I pick the policies that I like best. Is that not what I mentioned?
Is this being recorded? Yes, it is.
Thanks, everyone. And I appreciate it is early days and we are still living through the transitional period. But can NPF4 be said to have achieved anything yet?
Other than the confusion and delay that I mentioned at the beginning.
Something more positive, Elaine, please?
I think it varies from authority to authority. It's interesting, Neil, because you said, you know, there about local, you know, it's that interaction between the local development plan and NPF4. And I think some authorities seem to forget that the existing LDP is still part of the plan, and it's all about NPF4. So it seems to vary, you know, and then I've got, you know, a number of authorities that are requiring developers to justify the allocated site. Now it's allocated in the LDP. The LDP is still an existing part, you know, of the development plan, you know, and the chief planner confirmed, you know, in that letter that I mentioned, that allocations and allocated sites, but they're being asked, particularly under policy 5 on agricultural land, they're being asked to justify it, you know, and that's, so again, there's still those kind of tensions, as you say, between, you know, one and the other. And then, you know, we've also got that tension between you were talking about applications that have been started under the old system. Of course, we have a whole raft of LDPs that started under the old system. You know, and we've just had the Scottish ministers, you know, issuing the, you know, modifications which they required Aberdeen City to carry out to their LDP, which went forward under the old system, under the old transitional, you know, the transitional guidance says that you could have and proceed under your old SDP and your SPP. And now near the end, you know, having had all that consultation, near the end, they've said, oh, well, actually, now you need to make all of these changes and refer to NPF4. And the council have, you know, gone with that and adopted it. And I wondered whether the concern seemed to be because, of course, we also have, as I mentioned, kind of previously, in terms of the priority being given to whichever is the latest in adopting NPF, whatever the National Planning Framework is at the time, or the LDP. And of course, you're going to have a whole bundle of these old LDPs becoming the later of being adopted, which again is kind of recipe for confusion.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a cautionary note because, of course, whenever any significant change is introduced into development planning, there's always that difficult choice to be made of do you keep going, do you press ahead and avoid that risk of a sort of gap that may become increasingly long, or do you sit back and wait? And there's an authority that was quite sort of bold, and some might say, well, that was the right thing for it to do, but it's been sort of stung, if you like, at the other end of the process.
You've got a whole lot that were encouraged to go forward under the old system, and then with the guillotine and the introduction of NPF4, what's that done, to the plans?
Yep.
I actually had a related question, if you want to pick up on it now, which is, do the panel agree that the whole system would work better and provide more certainty to applicants if new policies were only applied to applications submitted following NPF4's adoption?
It was certainly something we were chatting about before, in terms of it would have been better to have had a proper transition as a date that things applied for, because we do have this uncertainty. And as I think we discussed last time when we had the change in the development management procedures, there was a date, and it was applications after the August date that it applied to, but then that was because it introduced pre-application consultation. And the flip side I can see is strategic development plans changed and LDPs changed, and you always have that coming in and new policies kind of changing. So arguably it's no different.
And I think it's very interesting from the delivery perspective that delivery is one of the key themes that comes through NPF4, but applying NPF4 almost retrospectively, as it were, to in-process applications and appeals has got in the way of that delivery agenda, because it either means things which started off looking as though they might be supported were then perhaps struggling. But it's also, as I think you were alluding to in part, it's not recognising that some aspects of the system are still going to be changing for several years, the LDPs in particular. So why is it that in-process applications and appeals have to be judged on completely different terms instantly, but LDPs, there's a spell for the new LDPs to work their way through the system and become adopted. So it does feel as though more thought could have been given to that aspect, as you said, the transitional.
As you say, it's not in a sense a new issue, but I think what is different this time round is that we had such significant changes being introduced at such a late stage, not to go back over old ground in NPF4, which generally with emerging policy, you're seeing what's coming down the track, and it's perhaps less of a surprise with fairly fundamental changes. So certainly that approach could have been taken in the transitional provisions. I guess we were probably all being a bit too optimistic that they might have been more helpful in that respect, but we are where we are. One thing I was going to say about, what has NPF4 might have achieved so far. I mean, obviously it is too soon, but I think what I've been struck by is just how adaptable and I guess resilient the industry is being in terms of developers and their consultant teams, and having to adapt to some of these new requirements coming through. So the applications that we're looking at now, sort of EIA packages, etc. So we're already seeing, for example, habitat management plans morphing into restoration and enhancement plans, and these things are more than just simply label changes. They're having to think about new requirements and think about what is it that developments can bring by way of additional value there. And if you're looking through an EIR, as I've been doing over the last week, it's actually quite, you know, when you think about, well, you know, in 20 years' time and 40 years' time, what is it that this development will now have delivered in terms of these enhancements to the environment? It's actually, you know, it's really encouraging to see. And I think in focusing in on those positive aspects, that being one of the main thrusts of NPF 4, you know, it's quite nice to think ahead when we'll be seeing those benefits coming through. Although possibly I'll be about retired by that point in time.
It's all about planting trees that you'll not be able to sit under.
Exactly.
I think though, to go negative from your positive.
Trying to lift the mood.
I know. Good. One of the concerns is, at least for the next few years, it's going to be just more paper. And it's not necessarily about the outcomes and the results, which is the positive, as you were saying, that the process on the way through gets bogged down. So we're still waiting to find out how we are going to address biodiversity and how much information and data and all the rest might be required. Because you delegated it to me, thank you, had to look at my first social value statement. And social value, absolutely, can see why there's aspects there the planning system needs to take account of, but it's yet another report. And that's my concern, that we're going to have a few years now until, as it tends to do, it settles down and there's a bit more of a proportionate approach. We're just going to have this information overload. We're going to have new methodologies, new assessments, and inevitably the inconsistent approaches between authorities, or dare I say it, between officers within the same authority.
Yep. Yeah, that's a concern. But I think I mean I am hopeful. So I do like to say positive in terms that it's short term as people get to grapple, and then it will start to get slicker. And the bit that I keep reminding everybody, it does encourage us to be bold and ambitious. Planning authorities are to be bold and ambitious, in taking this forward.
True.
Thank you, everyone. Now, you touched a bit there on local development plans. We've had sight of the new guidance for preparation of LDPs, and at over 200 pages, it is quite the read. Any views so far in the guidance from what you've seen?
Well, I'll maybe kick off, because I did read it all. And I've got some blogs, so it's watch this space. They will get published. Just need to finish them off. Yes, it is long, but well done to the team that did it. It's incredibly useful because it is a one-stop shop it outlines the legal requirements, because there have been some changes through the reforms, and I know this might sound a bit mad given that we're lawyers, but actually it can be quite hard to track through changes. We don't do law reform terribly well. That's the system, not us personally.
I was going to say that, so yes.
Yeah. So that's really good. It's a great start to a development plan team sitting going, right, what do we need to do? Kickstart the new LDP. But what it does really flag up, and in part just because it is so long, is that, oh gosh, there's so much that they're going to have to take on board in terms of new duties, new things they need to look at. And that's a bit of a concern, because we want these new LDPs, and we don't want to have to sit and wait, because the planners are still trying to figure out what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. Ironically, one of the problems is one of the new things, the evidence report, is right at the beginning. So you've no sooner started. Well, in fact, you're starting looking at the new thing going, oh, what do we have to do? And the guidance explains, so it's a good start. But the difficulty is, until the first few have gone through examination in front of a reporter, the gate check, no one quite knows. Every authority is going to be slightly different anyway, depending on the characteristics. And I think it's quite ironic because this round of LDPs will be the learning process, but it will really be the next round that learning can be put into practice. But the next round is 10 years after the first round.
So a different set of officers dealing with
probably,
it.
Yes.
I think that's it, Neil. It's just I think the size of the task, particularly in that sort of first bit of working on the evidence report, is quite a daunting one for the authorities. I mean, I've heard some senior officers say as much, and that you know, if certainly I've heard one officer say that if an authority had thought that they could perhaps, you know, produce their evidence report in 6 months, as might have been mooted, that might be quite an optimistic hope. So you know, they're really having to get down to it now, and probably just a bit of an issue of transparency at the moment and trying to kind of understand exactly where everyone is. And I don't say that in the sense of that anyone's trying to hide what they're up to, but just because I think, you know, the evidence gathering stage, you know, going about that process, beginning to kind of reach out and put things up on websites. If you look at a few different authority websites, you'll see some councils are producing fact sheets on different topic areas, etc., just to begin to engage with the public a little bit about what they're doing. But there aren't necessarily very clear stages that they can flag within that gathering stage. So I think that makes it perhaps a little difficult to understand just where everybody has got to. And I think the more formal stage of consultation on the evidence report won't come till quite late on. So that probably makes it a little difficult just to track where everyone is. I mean, in terms of how the evidence report might look at the end of the day, the guidance I thought was helpful in giving a template that's quite like the template of, we call them the Schedule 4s used in LDP processes for summarising unresolved reps. And I think by using that reasonably familiar format, that's helpful, because officers will feel they've got something kind of comforting and familiar there to latch onto. But it's certainly a big job of work, and the chunkiest part of the guidance is dealing with all the different bits of NPF4 that have to be dealt with, and that certainly goes on for quite a number of pages.
But is it a bit similar to what we said at the beginning? It's the first one, and then once they've got, you know, that's the baseline, because you need the baseline to go forward. And then the next LDP, albeit as you say, 10 years time, you've got a baseline to start, and it's a case of updating, and in fact updating it as you go through, so that you don't have to start interesting on your, you know, kind of your point on the 200 pages, because the chief planner spoke at SCGI lunch that I was at in Inverness yesterday. And, you know, she said she was shocked when it came to her in the same, you know, in the number of pages. But just like you, once you go through it, actually it is a good read, and it is useful, and that's why it stayed at that length. But yeah, that was the first one, and it is, you know, it takes up a lot of space in my case every time I've got it on the train to read.
And the thing is, it's needed because the regulations themselves are so short, and it doesn't answer, not that they're, to be honest, they take pretty similar format to the previous development planning regs. They're remarkably similar, but don't answer what would have been the key questions that people might have wanted to be answers in terms of either, you know, what is a sufficient,
yes,
you know, that test of sufficiency that reporters will be grappling with, and also perhaps putting a bit more flesh on the bones of the actual sort of gate check process, where, you know, it's really pretty much over to reporters' discretion. We probably shouldn't be hugely surprised on that front at the end of the day, but you know, that's where the regs are light.
I think for me as well, though, it's that concern of it doesn't seem to be making the LDP process any faster. So, you know, people that have started their evidence reports and starting that thing, it's still 4 years before they're predicting that the plan will be in place, and, you know, they've got 5 years to put them in place or whatever. But we can't have confusion and uncertainty for the next 5 years until we get LDPs, you know, kind of in place. It's quite a long period to cover in terms of, you know, NPF4 being kind of, I can't say the only document, because of course your existing LDP carries on, but gets older and older and less useful.
Yeah, I think that's been obviously the hope is that as everyone's saying, it gets easier next time round, but it's certainly going to be a continuing painful period, I think, until we're on a smoother footing with it all. But of course, as more cases, I think, begin to come out and we see how the policies are settling down, inevitably some of the questions will have been answered, and we'll not keep having those same debates, or we'll be having fewer of them, I would imagine.
So it sounds like potentially one for the holiday reading list, feeling which keep your eyes peeled for Neil's blogs. To shift topics slightly onto something that's perhaps attracted a bit less attention, that is, of course, changes to the use classes order. How significant do we see these changes to be following the various rounds of consultation that we've gone through, and indeed those that remain ongoing?
It's interesting because with changes initially with agricultural buildings, kind of changing in the conversion, that actually I spend quite a lot of time now interpreting those and how that's kind of worked. But the series of permitted development rates and kind of changes has been part, as I understand it, Scottish Government trying to remove the smaller applications from the system. We've got a huge resourcing problem. So the more that we can take out of the system and free up, kind of planners' time for the larger applications, the kind of better. But it's also in terms of, phase 2 was the one that introduced, to the class order, they changed, and we've got retail and professional services kind of come together, formerly classes 1 and 2, and we've now got a class 1A. And it means you no longer need permission for that change of use between the two classes. And that was aimed at promoting, the regeneration of town centres, kind of post-pandemic. And it goes hand in hand with new PD rights, the new class 11A, which permits changes of use, from your class 3, your food and drink, from the new class 1A. With the use as a betting shop, use as a payday loan shop, use as a hot food takeaway, but not if the unit is below a dwelling, which arguably to me doesn't help your traditional town centres where you used to live above the shop. So, and we often have that kind of parade of shops, exactly, if you like, at the bottom. Sticking with town centres, and I suppose town centres and things are important to me. I sit on, as you know, the Aberdeen Inspired, the Business Improvement District in City. So it is in Aberdeen City, it's about getting people kind of back in. So we've got the new class 9-11, which allows a class 3 use to have tables and chairs on the public road adjacent to their premises for the purposes of, selling or serving food or drink, supplied from those premises, and you can do all of that, and that's all to be welcomed. I think, back to that kind of trying to encourage people, cafe culture. I certainly see lots of people now wanting to sit outside, even in Aberdeen, and in Aberdeen we do sometimes get sunshine, and that's all to be welcomed. I am still finding resistance in some places in terms of structures, marquee structures. We do get some inclement weather in Aberdeen, and so it's not quite gone the full way. But I think the permitted development, those permitted development rights are useful.
I think the spirit of it, absolutely, I think we can all sign up to. There's also the new class you mentioned, 11A. There's the 11B that sort of sits with that, which is aimed at again thinking of our local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods and trying to sort of promote opportunities for business, class 4 business uses equally to benefit from changes from those same categories that you were mentioning, Elaine. But I suppose on a similar note, you mentioned the dwelling or flat above the shop. There's a similar sort of sting in the tail, I suppose, with the 11B, in that it's the size restriction, and that it's very much aimed at businesses at the smaller end of the scale, which certainly will be appropriate, but I think would perhaps limits the applicability overall. So I know that planning authorities, when the changes were being consulted upon, there were some concerns expressed. Well, I think the authorities again would be signed up to the principle of it, but they were perhaps expressing some concern about driving out the more traditional uses from town centres, or potentially having a knock-on implications for some of their smaller business parks across their areas. So, interestingly, it's not something that we're perhaps seeing a lot of clients asking us questions about, and whether that is reflective of it's just not sparking people's, appetite particularly, or on the other hand, maybe it's all going through smoothly. But I guess the changing face of town centres will show us in time whether it's bearing fruit. But it's certainly understandable that Scottish Government's trying to do all it can to give our town centres the kickstart they need.
It's that move to a town centre use, whereas we certainly, in Aberdeen used to have the kind of retail policy. They had to be a certain percentage of retail in certain blocks, going down Union Street.
Similar,
and obviously, we have moved away considerably from that. So I quite like that. As I say, what do you expect to see in your town centre? Well, there'll be lots of different things now, and not having to change the use between that and that should allow new uses to come in, more easily, rather than, well, it's going to be subject to planning and that kind of thing. From the start that, well, I'm going to be able to get that.
Yep. Real estate colleagues that are always asking us about use classes within their leases will find life easier.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. And I guess just to sort of move on slightly from the sort of anticipated change that we'd hope to bring to town centres, what else do you think we can expect in the rest of 2023 to come?
Instantly feel negative. No, feel positive.
Vlogs coming.
Yes. We've been talking about NPF4. There's obviously going to be more learning around how it applies in individual cases. So more experience there. One of the previous planning lives, we talked about biodiversity. We know Scottish Government, Nature Scot are looking at guidance about how we're going to look at biodiversity enhancement. So that's something to look out for. We were talking a minute ago about permitted development rights. There's consultation on some reform. There's more of that to come. So that's something to look out for. We're going to have Scotland's first National Planning Improvement Champion, which has come through planning reform. Craig McLaren, known to many people, well, probably most people, through his role with RTPI Scotland. So it'll be interesting to see what that role involves and achieves. As a lawyer, I feel I've got to mention there are still 2019 Act reforms to be rolled out. I know that might sound bizarre given that we're 4 years on, but that's the way it works. So we're still waiting to hear, for instance, master plan consent areas.
That's next. I can tell you hot address that is next, because Andy Kinnear mentioned that at the lunch yesterday. That is going to be the next part that they're working on. They started working on it, and picking up on the town centre, they see that as key in terms of the town centre regeneration. I did ask, what's the difference between simplified planning zones and enterprise zones, which everybody could be using at the moment, and master plan consent. So it will be about making that more attractive and encouraging local authorities to use master plan consents. I thought you were going to say the kind of infrastructure levy. Where's that gone?
I was going to say that. Just to show that we don't have this completely scripted. Yes, we wait for infrastructure levy. It's got the sunset clause. I don't have the date in front of me. I think it's 2026, maybe use it or lose it.
But there was 7 years left.
So I did calculate it, and they're discussing it at the moment in England. The consultation, I think, maybe just ended because I saw a lot of English planning lawyers on LinkedIn talking about the responses they'd put in. It didn't seem to be universally accepted, funnily enough. So we'll need to wait and see on that.
It's funny, the infrastructure levy had come up in a conversation I was having recently in the context of biodiversity and enhancements, because of course one of the things that's mentioned as infrastructure within the Act is blue and green infrastructure, and we were discussing some of the challenges of sort of off-site enhancements and how that can be dealt with. and whether you're potentially coming back to some kind of arrangement about commuted sums. But if we're looking at sort of regional networks and more strategic connections across Scotland, whether that might ultimately find a place within the infrastructure levy. So maybe it could provide some help with the other issues that we're experiencing elsewhere under reform. So interesting. But yes, other things to look out for. I mean, you've mentioned just cases, Neil, and of course we picked up on the housing ones at the beginning of today's talk. There are if we can call them, the agent of change cases that will be going through the process, the call-in process with the DPA, which I think people will be looking out for with interest. Obviously, we've got those in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And I think there was an Aberdeen one as well, was there, Elaine? So that will be obviously has particular significance for our sort of city centres, etc. And
another one, again, thinking about what's happening in England that might influence what happens here, is environmental outcome reports replacing environmental impact assessment. And that's ongoing at the moment through the Westminster Parliament, and whether that will come through in England and Wales, and if it does, it comes through in Scotland. This is very much a wait and see.
Yep, all our environmental consultants just having got to grips with the last series of changes that were brought through was ever thus.
Thanks, everyone. As ever, we could chat planning all afternoon. I'm very conscious of time. In the final few minutes then, just a few last questions. Quickly, what is your planning highlight of 2023 so far? We'll start with Elaine.
Oh, that's a hard one.
That's a hard one.
So many.
I always like to think
so many.
The highlights yet to come. Planning Live, all our various Planning Live and all the guests that we've had on. Our Homes Conference that we had this week with the Housing Minister, and we launched our housing report, which kind of themes that are relevant, in terms of we need collaboration, imagination and localization. I suppose my one would be, I love the NPF4 stresses that we should be bold, ambitious, and I keep saying that, and I want to see, and I'm still hopeful that I will see that come through, and that we will start to see bold and ambitious development schemes.
There you go. Well, I am going to say that my highlight is yet to come, because of course Neil's new book has yet to hit the shelves, but to be expected.
It took 45
later.
Minutes for anyone to mention it.
Tim, give me that 10-point note afterwards. So Neil's book, watch out, folks. But the other thing I was going to mention was that I had taken part in the HOPS conference as one of the panelists a few months back, and it was a really interesting conference because it was very much focusing on the issues of climate change, coast being hosted in North Ayrshire as it was, and also the nature crisis. But the thing that made it most memorable for me was that it was really the big farewell at the end of the conference from Jim Miller, who was just retiring from North Ayrshire and also sort of finishing his role with HOPS. And honestly, there was not a dry eye in the house. It was lovely to hear from him. But I think just what that emphasised for me, without getting sentimental at the end of the podcast, is just thinking about the people in the system, because we're always talking about our policies and our projects and all the rest of it. But there was someone who had such long service to planning, both at the council and in the various sort of groups that he'd given his time to. And that's really what it comes back to a lot in planning. It's the people that are working in the system and and the service that they're giving. So I found that to be quite inspiring.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this chat's my highlight. It's been really good.
That must have been a low bar.
But I think maybe just picking up on what Karen was saying about the people, that I was thinking the highlight was some of the appeals we won. Winning's good, but actually it was a highlight because of the people that were involved. It was clients who were really invested in the project. It wasn't, you felt, just the business, and their professional team being quite committed and really working very hard to push it through the system. And as we know, that being quite laborious, and some of them not necessarily professional developers. So that was a bit of a highlight, was being able to be part of the team that got the result for them, and just being pleased for the client and the team.
Yeah, no, I always think it's, when people say, what do you like most about being, kind of planning lawyer, it is about the people. And, from the small kind of extension to a house to the kind of large scheme, they're all important in different ways to the people. And you're right, kind of everybody, you talked about the resilience of people in the industry in terms of getting together, grappling with reform, and then kind of moving forward. So that's quite a nice way of I like
positive
that.
note to finish on.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Neil, Elaine, Karen. We've covered a lot of ground there. Inevitably, apologies, we are at least a couple of minutes over time, so I'll wrap up quickly. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you very much to everyone at home for joining us this afternoon. We hope you have enjoyed today's session, the recording for which, as I mentioned at the start, will be made available in the next few days. Sadly, this is the last of our Planning Live sessions for a few weeks while we enjoy a bit of a summer break, but rest assured we'll be back in the autumn with a new lineup of planning guests and topics. Keep an eye on our emails and social media for details in due course. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.
Thank you.